Good afternoon. Thank you so very much for joining me. This is Dr. Chantella Sherman, and I am here with the Acumen Group and Acumen Magazine to do another installment of Real Talk. And so, thank you so much for joining me. For those of you who don't know me, again, I am Dr. Chantella Sherman. I am a public historian who specializes in the American eugenics movement, but also in all things related to race, gender, identity formation, entitlement bias, and in some instances, whiteness studies. Um, Part of my purview is also um, anything related to protocol that started out as eugenic or scientific racism, as some people may call it, and then morphed out into every aspect of our daily lives. So whether that's housing, education, law enforcement, pop culture. Um, a lot of times there's a eugenic stream that informs the racism, and that's the reason why it's hard to break these things apart because we rarely ever deconstruct them in such a way where we hit at the actual core. And once we don't break the core apart, it's like having a seed that simply gets rooted and then continues to sprout out in different areas. So we've been doing a number of sessions in lieu of not being able to do actual lectures, public lectures at libraries or on college campuses. The Acumen Group is doing a number of series of little short, quick snippets that I'm facilitating that center around eugenics or racial themes in popular television and film. And so one of the things that we've been looking at in the last couple of weeks is the television series Lovecraft Country. And so we're looking at a certain number of historical themes that were touched upon within the series. I think they're up to episode 6 now. They've been touched upon, but not really fleshed out in such a way that the average person understands exactly how that impacts or informs larger histories. And so, what I've asked you guys to do, and what you've done amazingly well, is sent emails to the Acumen Group, to Acumen Magazine, to allow me to kind of flesh out those questions for you and add a little bit of nuance to them. And so I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. So for those of you who are just coming in for the first time, you'll kind of know exactly where we are within the series and what we're doing. Please note that Lovecraft Country isn't the only vehicle that we'll use. And as we go through certain scenes, I'll give you additional resources, whether they're books, other films, to kind of touch on so that you'll see how the film or the series or the scene doesn't happen in a vacuum. All right. And so, starting out Lovecraft Country, one of the things that we dealt with was the concept of sundown towns. And I say the concept, but it's actually the reality of sundown towns. And a sundown town, again, is a space where Black people may have been allowed to be in those cities, counties, towns while there was daylight. But as soon as the sun became, sun is going down, if you're a Black person, you needed to be outside of the city limits or the county limits, or you were subject to arrest, some type of terrorism or torture, or in many cases, death. Your life was in peril if these people got behind you. And these were townspeople, as well as law enforcement, as well as government officials. Everyone was on the same accord with this. So this is what we call levelized white supremacy, where the entire town is in agreement from the smallest child to the oldest resident. And so in many instances where you may see signs on buildings or restaurants, we've seen that in films where it says whites only or colored area only. Some of these same towns restricted Black mobility completely. You were not allowed in these towns when sundown came. And so we deal with the term Anna. In some instances, instead of there being a sign saying no Blacks are allowed, no Negroes allowed, there's a term ANNA that was put on billboards, small signs in yards. ANNA means ain't no niggas allowed. And so these were seen all over the country, all over the nation. And so we've dealt with blowing up a certain number of myths about Anna towns or Anna spaces. And under white supremacy, please understand that these are not strictly cities, towns, or states in some instances that are in the South. Most of them actually are in the Midwest and in northern spaces, Massachusetts, Vermont. Um, and what you'll find is that historically, these are towns that may have started out integrated with a black neighborhood on one side of the track and a white neighborhood on the opposite side of the track. But um, something facilitated white mob violence that ran the black denizens, ran the black residents out of the area and then conscripted them and kept them from ever being able to return to the area. So we also talk about the bridge because we have to be able to always connect A to B to C to D. And so you'll start to see how restrictive covenants came into bearing where if you've been run out of a space where you white people say we don't want black people here at all, and they've been there at some point, you now have restrictive covenants for housing, which dictated you cannot rent, lease, or own property if you are a black person in particular spaces. And these were legal and ultra legal um, examples of white supremacy, where you have a real estate agent, a banker or banking system, including neighbors, as well as a city council, who all work together to ensure that a particular neighborhood or certain neighborhoods are strictly whites only. All right. And if a black person somehow is um, allowed into that neighborhood, usually by some type of forfeiture, it would be an instance where they have a white friend, a black person has a white friend who signs on the deed, signs on the leases, signs on the mortgage for them. So visually, what you see is a white person moving in, and then the black person actually takes possession of the home. These black people were subject to crosses being burned on their lawns. They were subject to terrorism, where white neighbors would come in and tear up the houses or try and violate or physically harm them. Molotov cocktails thrown through windows, and again, the idea was not to damage the property if at all possible, because the value of the neighborhood itself is tied to the legitimacy of that property and it being stable. And so, again, restrictive covenants come into play where you have instances of, if it's an entire neighborhood of white people and a home becomes available, they will get their money together, put in a higher bid to ensure that a black person cannot get that home, even if it stays empty. It won't be occupied by a black person. Also, within their mortgages and the agreements that they have with the banks, there were certain covenants that white families signed off on that said if in the event they decided to leave that property to move somewhere else, they were obligated to sell that property to another white person. All right. Also understanding that when you have banking systems that kind of work in tandem and they collaborate and conspire. It's probably the proper term here. With white supremacy, they're all in this together. What you also have is a balancing system where if there's a white person who's purchased the home and the value of that home is $100,000, they're still paying on the home. A black person moving into that neighborhood, the insurance policies now say that the $100,000 home has lost between one half and three quarters of its value. So now this white person's home is now devalued by 50 to 75% based on the fact that one black person moved into that neighborhood. So there were always economic components to these issues where white people felt in some instances that they had to protect the value of their home, their property, the folks around them, and the investments that they placed into the neighborhood by ensuring that no black person was in those spaces. And so as we push forward, again, nothing is happening in a vacuum. Um, One of the things that we see in Lovecraft Country is the fact that you have these people trying to get out of town as the sun is coming down, and they're literally trying to race against the sun, knowing that they can't go over the speed limit. One of the things that also will happen, or would happen in instances where the police did pull a person over, um, they were subject to a new form of slavery. Okay. And this is it's a very weird concept when we talk about the 13th Amendment, and the Emancipation Proclamation, and slavery has been abolished. If you ever take the time to actually read the 13th Amendment, there is a loophole in it. And that loophole says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So this means if you are arrested by the police, um, and you are incarcerated, your labor, your free labor, is now a part of your conviction. And so this helped to precipitate what we're going to talk a little bit about today, and that is the concept of convict leasing. Now, when you tie the economy, and a free economy, free labor, to the value of your products, and the ability to do business, it automatically means that people who don't really have money or who want to make a great profit say, I want the free labor. Because if I don't have any overhead, then I can actually turn a profit no matter what the industry is doing at any given moment. And so what we start to see beginning in 1866 is that any black male specifically, but black women were also subject to this, and black children as well. Any black male who came across a police officer, or sassed someone, the police were called, they were subject to being arrested and being told that they owed a fine. That fine was usually something so exorbitant that no one in it, that unless you were wealthy, would be able to pay it. So if it's 1875 and someone tells you you owe a $100 fine for the crime of loitering or vagrancy, um, you were told, obviously you can't pay the charge. And uh, basically, the sheriff would find an industry that needed free labor, that needed a worker, and they would pull you in, talk to you a little bit, and tell you basically, until you pay this fine, you have to work for this particular company or for this particular person until they say that the debt is paid. And so it goes into, I think there are a number of different scenes that I've posted on Facebook for you to kind of get an idea of it. If you have time to check out the film The Honey Dripper, the film itself is supposed to be about blues music, in a very rural space, and we get that. But one of the pivotal points of the film is that a young man who happens to hop off of a train and start walking down a town that he's unfamiliar with is stopped by a sheriff, and the sheriff says, where are you going? And the man says, I'm looking for a job. Well, the fact that he does not have a job is a crime. It was a crime for black men not to have a job, because it was believed that in not having a crime, it precipitated a crime, which meant they would eventually decide to steal, rob, pillage, or whatever else. So it became a crime on the books not to have a job if you were a black man, which meant you automatically were subject to being yanked in and having your labor stole. All right. So this young man is told, okay, you have to go work for this man picking cotton. And the guy's like from Chicago. He's from a northern space who happens to come through this. And he says, I've never picked cotton before. And don't I need a jury of my peers? Don't I get to have a trial? And the sheriff says, you just had your trial. This man here, who's also a planter and owns a sharecropping farm, is a judge. So you've just seen the judge get a sack, and he will let you know when your time is up and you've served out the debt that you owe for doing nothing but basically being there. And so this also works into the concept of the 1 to 99 sentence. We don't talk very much in American history about the fact that when a person tells you, I was wrongly convicted, or I didn't do the crime that they say I did, or I was arrested for nothing, a lot of times people have thought that that was just bogus, and no one wants to admit that they've committed a crime. The book and the documentary, Slavery by Another Name, is a tremendous work where you've had historians document the fact that you literally would have black men or black women on their way to work, standing at bus stops, walking to work, and the police would pick them up and arrest them, and they would basically disappear from their families. We don't have cell phones at this point. We don't have email. We don't have very much any way of contacting family members or anyone else to let them know I didn't disappear. I am in prison, and I'm technically in prison, but I'm off the books. So I've been taken straight from off the road to the place where I'm going to work. And literally, the person would work the entire day and then be confined in a prison cell at night, shackled up. So there was no way for them to escape. All right. And so what you start to see with slavery by another name is that companies like DuPont, who make our tires, they needed people to work these rubber farms or rubber plantations. And this continues today, and I'll get into that shortly. But you basically had people who would disappear, and they needed the women to be seamstresses and to make mattresses and to make blankets and to do certain industry that they could get an immigrant person if they were in New York to come in and you have a garment district. That's one thing. But if you're in other spaces and you're trying to compete with New York and an immigrant who you still have to pay, what you go and find is a convict. You find someone who's already in prison. You talk to the prison itself and you let them know we need working bodies. And so the way it looks on paper is that you're repaying your debt to society for the crime that you committed by working off the debt. The problem is if you have a sentence of 1 to 99, it basically means the person who owns the business gets to determine when he's worked you enough in order to pay back that 50, 75, or $100 fine. And think in terms of a $70 fine or a $100 fine in 1920 or 1940 may as well have been a $5,000 fine today. And if you don't have someone who can get that money for you, or no one knows that you're there, you're literally pulled off the street and you've gone missing, and your labor is being used to fuel American industry at this point. It's an amazing, amazing concept, and at the same time, it is something that we continue to deal with today. And so we'll break into that shortly. As I'm talking, if you have any questions, please load those questions into the comment section, and I'll be answering those as well as we go through. It is estimated that roughly 400,000 or 500,000 people, Black people, have gone missing in this country from roughly 1866 to the present. All right. No one knows exactly where they went, and sometimes you'll find folks who can break away from it. One of the things that I posted is from the piano lesson, and this is an August Wilson play that was picked up by Hallmark a number of years ago. And with Hallmark, they decided you have Alfred Woodard and you have uh, Charles Dutton, a number of great actors in this space. The scene that was posted on the Acumen Group page talks about the fact that at one point you had four generations of Black men in one Mississippi county who, within their lifetimes, at some point, um, had been forced onto, in Mississippi's case, Parchman Farm. And I am a Jackson State University alumna, so I can tell you right now, Parchman Farm is still very much active. And the first time I ever saw prisoners working in a chain gang, basically, they weren't chained at this point, but there was someone with a gun on them. They were cleaning up the highways, and this was 1994, 1995. So convict leasing is still there. In some instances, in the case of Mississippi, they were using them to do the road work. So they were being taught how to do pavement and asphalt, to also pick up trash. But the guardrails, the things that you see along the highway, these weren't put together by work crews from the state. The state said rather than putting this into a budget line into the a budget line item, in the budget each year, we have able-bodied people that we've arrested and who've been convicted. And so we're going to use their labor to do the work that we don't really want to have to pay for anyway. I see Crystal Mincy has sent the question in. Hey, Kim Webster, I'm glad you joined. Aren't there still debtors prisons in Mississippi? Yes, there are debtors prisons everywhere, and they're technically illegal. But if you're once again in a small county or a small town where, the law is attached to the industry itself, there's no real way of getting around it. And so you owe money to someone, and it turns out this person tells you, okay, if you don't pay the money, I'm going to call the police. Well, if you don't have the money, you don't have the money. So you being locked up in prison is not even really a punishment. It's just a very evil and angry way, of exacting revenge upon you for not giving the money over. But it's like, if the money's not there, it's not there. Debtors prisons still exist. And so again, part of the problem is, if industry is connected to this, it means, there's always, as far as the industry is concerned, a surplus of bodies that are there. And so once a person, like the DuPont company, once they got you onto these rubber plantations and decided to use your labor, they would determine, as the markets are shifting up and down, whether they need more people or less. And because greed is always an element of this, they always needed more people. So you're working from sun up to sundown in miserable conditions. You're chained inside the prisons. Sometimes they're barracks, that they've put up like little campers, along the sides of roads, and they're back off in the off the main road, so a lot of people don't know that they're there. But these men were being starved half to death. They were being beaten. They were being sexually violated as well. And again, their relatives have no idea that they're even there. So what you start to have again with the piano lesson is the fact that you have these four generations of men. They're sitting there, and one of them, starts singing a song that they sang on the work gang. Um, and it's a very, very powerful scene, in the sense that probably the oldest man that's represented there may be in his 70s at this point. And the younger men, Courtney B. Vance is probably the youngest man in this scene. And at the time, he's supposed to be roughly in his 20s. All right. So the fact that you have a 50-year gap, but that all of these men have somehow been touched by the violation of being picked up off the street for absolutely nothing, um, and their labor used. And there was a slogan that was used, and a number of folks have written books about it, where it says, if one dies, just grab another. If one dies, just have the police pick up a random black man off the street, and pull him in. And so some of the crimes that you could be convicted for, arrested for, as a black man or black woman, um, up until maybe the 1980s, in some of these spaces, were things like, not getting off the sidewalk quick enough if there was a white person coming. Again, vagrancy, idleness. And I kept saying, what does idleness mean? Um, you know how your parents or your grandparents would tell you things years ago, especially if you're in a city, a urban space, and they would say, don't just stand around talking. The belief was that if you caught more than two black people talking together, and they were congregating, that they were plotting. They were plotting, they were planning, they were hatching plans to do something that was evil, sinister, or what have you. And so, literally, it on the books, it gives law enforcement the right to tell these young men, turn around, get up against the wall, or get on the ground, to strip them down, to search them. And by the time we get fast forward 100 years later, and we're in 1990, 1995, and you start to see Los Angeles erupting, over the fact that police are routinely stopping young black men and just telling them strip down. And there are a number of photos that were taken by, the LA Times, by Associated Press photographers, of young black boys, usually teenagers, some tweens, 11, 12, 13 to maybe 30 years old, up against walls, and they're just in their underwear at this point. They've made them strip down completely. This wasn't about drugs. They weren't even really searching them. It was literally just to harass them. They're at, the police have guns drawn on them. And so it was just and they take all the clothes, throw them in a heap, laugh at them, taunt them, and then just kind of go off. But in other instances, they would actually take some of these young men, they would arrest them for something silly, talking back to the police, rolling their eyes at the police, not being respectful. They would say that this was a resisting. You were resisting the police. And in those instances, they were picked up. They're taken into juvenile court, where you have someone saying, we're going to fix you. We're going to make sure that you aren't out here committing crimes, even though no crime was ever initially committed. These young men are then taken off, and by the time they get where they're going, they realize that they're either pressing license plates, and yes, people are still pressing license plates. Um, they're sewing things, they're making calls. This is, and I have a whole list of different companies and different things that you'll have that are part of what we call now prison industry. But prison industry grew out of convict leasing. And so then there was absolutely no overhead. So the men weren't paid anything. Their room and their board, being shackled in a prison, what they would say is that, the courts would say, you owed the prisoner or you owed this business person for housing and feeding you during the time they incarcerated and detained you. So any money that we would have given you now comes to us. All right. Or you have to pay restitution for the crime of loitering. All right. So they determine what the fines are. There's nothing written to tell you exactly what the fines are. And so you have people that literally work until they die. Some of you have seen the film Life. And even though Life was supposed to have been comical, um, it was tragic in all respects, because the only way you could get out of some of these situations, most times, 90% of the time, was to escape. And so you saw with Martin Lawrence's character, Eddie Murphy's character, one of them is always trying. Eddie Murphy's character is like, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to find a way of escaping. I'm not staying here because they're going to work us until we leave here in a box. And it's clear that no crime has actually been committed, but the labor of the town, the labor of the county, the labor of the city is being taken care of by these imprisoned, incarcerated people. And so it is another form of slavery, but it goes again to the whole point of why you're stopping Black people randomly as they're, coming through your town, or setting it up as a sundown town so that you can add bodies and labor to an industry that thrives off of free labor. And so when we get to, again, if you have questions, put them in. When we start looking at the system today, what you'll find, and this kind of, I actually wrote this down because I kept thinking this has to be wrong. It couldn't possibly be true that I'm reading this, but um, in the state of California, it says that inmates processed this past year more than 680,000 pounds of beef, 400,000 pounds of chicken products, 450,000 gallons of milk, 280,000 loaves of bread, and 2.9 million eggs. Okay. They have farms. They've made part of the prison areas farms. And so a lot of times what we're eating, what we're buying off the shelves in stores, is actually coming from the free labor of these incarcerated people who've been put in prison in many instances for no particular reason at all. All right. Also, you have corporations today that piggyback on that. And so it's not just the county that's saying, we want your labor to help create the bridges or to, fix the potholes in the road. Or again, in the case of California, as volunteer firefighters. Now, technically, you're not volunteering because you're in prison. So um, sometimes the emphasis, the whole reason why you want to be a part of something else is, they'll tell you, if you go ahead and work as a volunteer firefighter, volunteer now from the prison, whenever you do get out, you don't have to go through the whole training process of becoming a firefighter. And it's a legitimate way of you working your way into um, an actual firefighter fires union and having a legitimate job when you come out. In the meantime, these men have no benefits. If something happens to them while they're fighting fires, their families aren't getting restitution off of this, because again, their belief is that they're paying restitution back to the county or the city for the fact that they committed a crime in the first place. So again, if it's the county or city, that's one thing. But there are also corporations, major corporations, who use convict leasing. They use convicts in order to do their work. Now, how many of you have been receiving, say, in the last 2 months, a bunch of robocalls, all right, about elections or whatever else? All right. Well, The robocalls have been replaced in many instances with people who have a list, and it's like a phone center. It's a phone bank. These are prisoners. All right. If there's a human person on the phone, it tends to be a prisoner who's now working a phone bank as a part of his quote or her quote unquote restitution. So during election seasons, the person that you're speaking with on the phone most likely is someone who's been hired out, or they've set up or established, especially within private prisons, they've established different industries that benefit that particular industry. And so you stay right there at the prison and just maybe go down into another wing, and that's where all the phone banks are. Or the farming, again, is off on another side of the prison, but you're still behind bars as you're actually doing your work. Um, a number of the companies that really made me sit up and take notice: Starbucks. All right. Starbucks, they use a subcontractor called Signature Packaging Solutions. And they use prisoners in Washington state to package anytime you have holiday gifts, coffee, um, any type of special items that come from Starbucks. The prisoners in Washington state are actually packaging all of those items, whether it's coffee or stuffed animals or whatever it is, the Christmas tinsels or ornaments that they're using. All of those things are packaged in Washington state by prisoners. Another company that got me, Nintendo Game Boys. Nintendo decided that they want to use, they wanted the shrink wrap that goes on the gaming or the packaging, actually putting things in the packaging and putting the what do you call them? The things that kind of protect the items from shifting or whatever. All of that's done by prisoners, again, in Washington state. Texas inmates. Now, Texas is pretty ferocious. Texas uses inmates to create things that they need for the state, in addition to hiring them out for corporations. So if you're in a government building and there's a janitor or custodian, they need things like brooms, brushes, um, the sinks, um, the toilets. All of those are made by prison industry in the state of Texas, and then they're put into different buildings. But you never know that an actual prisoner created these things in prison while locked up. So again, it makes it so that there is no overhead at all, and you're basically just using the labor, which is steadfast, is guaranteed, and there is, there's nothing that the prisoners can really do. I understand that there are a number of contracts that they do sign, and on each page, they have to initial or sign saying, "I am doing this of my own free will. I'm doing this of my own free will," because it is understood that um, convict leasing still exists. And what we often ask is, in the same way under slavery, that a signature or an agreement made under duress cannot really be considered a legitimate contract. The consensus is still out as to whether these men are actually signing, or women are signing, saying that they agree to the terms of working for free or pretty much nothing, or very, very little, or if they're basically being pushed or forced into doing this under duress. Another company, Microsoft. 1990s, Microsoft used, again, Washington prisoners in the state of Washington to shrink wrap software, up to 20,000 Microsoft, the mouses, the mouse devices that they use for um, any of their software, their computers, their laptops, whatever it is that they have. Those were being shrink wrapped in prison industry. Um, California, any type of, and I get this, most of the state prisoners are also making furniture for courthouses and college campuses. And so the first time I did see this in Mississippi once, where if you turn the desk around to the back, there's a little sticker on it that does say Mississippi prison industry, or it's a code for it. And basically, what it's saying is that your desk, your beds, anything that's in that dorm room was made by a prisoner, incarcerated, sometimes in the state where you are, and then other times it's cheaper to have it done at a private prison when the private prison industry kind of took off in places like Idaho, Iowa, Minnesota. Basically, it was cheaper still to have it done through a private contractor at a private prison because they were being paid even less, or there was even less coming off the top in these private prisons than there would be under state. But it's an amazing thing. Book carts, locker room benches, even juice boxes that would then go on to a company where they would put the juice in, but the cartons have to be made. And so the cartons were being done in prisons. There's a company called Unicor, which is part of the federal prison industry. By the way, if you are in Washington, D.C., and you are charged with a felony, you are automatically sent outside of D.C. and into a private prison. All right. So this means a great deal for people who are in the District of Columbia because sometimes, again, it is up to not the letter of the law, but the discretion of the judge or the person charging you to determine whether the crime you committed is a misdemeanor or a felony. So sometimes it's as simple an equation as is there money in the budget to send this person locally, to maintain them locally, or to go ahead and charge them with a felony, especially if it's right there on the line based upon criteria? Charge them with a felony so that they're sent out of our jurisdiction, they're sent into another jurisdiction where they become someone else's quote unquote problem, but at the same time, their labor goes into that whole forced convict leasing system where you're doing all types of things for free and these corporations are getting over on it at the same time. um, Victoria's Secret, once again, most of the sewing, whether it's the garment or the labels, Victoria's Secret is using or had been using a company called Third Generation, and they use the prisoners in South Carolina, female prisoners in South Carolina, to sew lingerie and leisure wear. And so you would say, how again can all of this still function? Well, you would think as time goes on and we're saying this shouldn't be happening, that there would be no entry into it. But the fact of the matter is, as long as there's an economic um, incentive to do it, then that's exactly what you have. So as late as 1979, Congress created the Prison Industry Enhancement Certification Program. And this certification program basically said that, it's going to provide private sector companies with access to prisoners in order to use their labor. All right. So once you get a private company that can now buy into using the labor from the prisoners and then saying, okay, this will now make the prison industry work because these men or women won't be left to do nothing. They're repaying their debt to society. It's actually helping the economy. Um, it kind of made a lot of people that would normally say, this is inhumane. This is something that should not be happening. It's subjugation on a different type of level. They literally said, okay, well, maybe it is good for them not to just be idle and doing nothing. Now, let's forget about educational programs or actually trying to treat emotional issues or drug dependencies or any other type of issues that the person may you know have been labored with that cause them to commit crimes if a crime was committed. No, instead let's just use their labor. It's a rather insidious way of just sponging off of folks in many instances who cannot help themselves and have no voice. Also, just I did have one person send a question into the email, and that was, in some instances, prisoners are given wage packages, and that is true. The amount of money that they're given, for instance, the work that Microsoft had the folks doing in the Washington prison, they would pay someone on the outside somewhere between $30 and $70 to do the same work. The people inside the prison were being paid $7 an hour. Okay. And then of that $7 that they were getting per hour, I found the breakdown and it says that there are automatic wage deductions. Okay. So, number one, all inmates participating in these programs will have deductions made of their gross wages for federal, state, and local taxes, which first of all, that made me just all over. It's like, okay, that's silliness, but reasonable charges for room and board. It's a prison. Okay, but now you have to pay for your own room and board inside the prison. So many prisoners, I didn't realize this, left with a bill. So some of them may feel like I need to be involved in prison industry because if I don't, when I leave out of the prison, I actually owe a debt to the prison who just held me for however many years, even if it was a wrongful conviction. All right. Um, if the inmate owes restitution, room and board charges may be activated and the amount collected each month applied to the inmate's owed restitution. Now, here's the other thing: you don't know exactly how much the judge is attaching, how much restitution charge he's attaching to each person that comes in. So, what is the rate that you have to pay back for, say, a robbery fine or a theft fine, or what does that mean? And is it restitution? Sometimes it's going to the victims of the crime. Other times it's going to the courts. And so all of that for me still reads like the old convict leasing system, where again, if anything is paid to you, you owe that money back to the person who jailed you for your upkeep during the time that you were in prison. It also states until it's paid in full, the inmate must remain employed. If the if the first inmate decides that they no longer want to be employed, then that debt goes back onto their record, and so even whatever it is that they have worked off goes back into being owed. So you understand again that it's again a very, very sinister space. But when you add economic incentive to this, you understand how something that began in 1866, and again, please impress upon people to read the law. All right, we as Black people are always shouting about the Emancipation Proclamation and this 13th Amendment, but if you don't read the 13th Amendment, you don't understand how every time it looks like we're on a even keel and we're making restitution and we're talking about equity and everything being equal, you'll always have white supremacy on the opposite side offering some type of answer to that. And so the pull back to the 13th Amendment, when you literally look at this document and see at the bottom, okay, except in cases of incarceration. So as soon as you are arrested, technically enslavement, the Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment no longer applies. All right. You've been arrested and convicted of a crime. And so now you're subject to all of the horrors and traumas of enslavement in the same way that your forefathers were. All right. So we really, really, really have to pay attention to that. Um, Yeah, support of the inmate's family pursuant to the state statute. This is also something that comes out of this. If they find that an inmate has children, or especially children, I don't think it is necessarily for a spouse, but if the prison finds out that a man who's incarcerated has a child, they will automatically, pursue child support on behalf of the mother or mothers of those children. And then once again, that money is accruing during the time that the person is in prison. So they're telling you, we don't care if you don't have a job out there, your children still need to eat. And instead of having the system pick up your debt for your children through EBT or public housing or anything like that, we're attaching that to your bill technically as head of household. And so again, a lot of these people that go into prison for little or nothing actually come out with an exorbitant amount of debt. And if you're already under a felony conviction, it means that when you come out and you have to check the box saying that you've been convicted of a felony, a lot of times you're kept from the jobs that you need the most in order to be able to support your children, support your family, or pay that restitution debt that you owe both to the prison and to the folks that you may have harmed in the process of your crime. And so again, it's very, very important that you don't assume that just because the person is in prison, number one, that they're guilty. That number two, we start to look at more closely and very, very clearly the products that we purchase and who is packing and pulling and doing the labor, because unfortunately we're actually tied to the very things sometimes that we're trying to stop. And so we've had a number of whistleblowers who've come out, including
a group, I believe, that was in Montana who told a reporter they were able to get to a phone one day and told a New York Times reporter that they had been charged with their job in prison was to take labels off of different items that were coming in from overseas and put "Made in America" stickers on them. All right, so that's a whole job. All right, so once the person told this, it became an issue, but the prisoners were then put into solitary confinement for having talked on the phone and having squealed and told it all. But we need to look into Microsoft, and we need to look into Victoria's Secret and to Starbucks, and to literally challenge these businesses, these corporations, these major corporations. Also Boeing, and there's a whole list that I'll provide. You know, if you want the complete list, I'll give you the link and send all that stuff over to you. So please just inbox me and I'll let you know. But you know, I'll send this over to you. But Boeing, you know, when you start thinking of these major international corporations that are literally getting richer because they're not using American employees in the way that they should, instead of decided they're going to go into the prison system and use free convicts labor, and then still turn around and charge you and me exorbitant amounts of money for cell phones or, you know, this, that, and the other. And the whole time we're not understanding that "Made in America" doesn't mean made by you know, paid labor in America, but in many instances means um, you know, working off the backs of people who are already incarcerated. So it goes also to the concept of, or the realities of, mass incarceration. Why are you picking up so many people in a record number of times over an amazingly small space? And we're starting to look at things like, I think I said America's the only um, country in the world where you have this many citizens in prison. And I think they said only China has something that's comparable, but based upon the population, it makes sense there. It doesn't make sense that we have this many people in America in prison for crimes that, you know, alternatively would mean something else. This person needs to be in some type of treatment program. This person needs to be looked at in a different way. But there are approximately, and I'm going to make sure I get this number, half a trillion. Yep, half a trillion people in America that are either at this point in prison, on parole, on probation, or somehow tied to the legal system. They've been prisoners. They are imprisoned at this time. And what's happening is that their labor is the reason why um you know, it's so exciting and so necessary to have them there, to have them in prison, because if you pull them out, and as they close prisons across the nation, these private prisons, what you start to find is the very industries where you use that convict leasing labor, they start to the companies start to slide, because you now have to pay a reasonable and rational amount of money to someone to do the work. All right. So once again, if you have questions, go ahead and load them up. Otherwise, I'm going to give you a quick list of resources and source information, just in case you want to find a book or check out another video related to what we're talking about here. Again, the films are The Piano Lesson, The Honey Dripper, Life, and Slavery by Another Name. There's a great website called the Sentencing Project, which looks at the numbers since 1866 to the present, the number of incarcerated, the reason why they were incarcerated, and how their labor has impacted the economy of the nation, and then the global economy as well. And then a number of books. Slavery by Another Name, again, there's a companion book. Actually, the book came before the documentary, if I'm not um, mistaken. Hey, Robert Edwards, I see you on here. Another book, Worse Than Slavery by David Oshinsky. If Beulah Bell was on here, she would get this. We have one student in a master's program at Jackson State University who was talking constantly about David Oshinsky's book, which was Worse Than Slavery. And again, the concept is if you're enslaved in a space, it's clear that your labor has value. But if someone says, by working you to death, I simply have to go find another Black person and incarcerate them and put them through the same thing, it means that I can abuse you and use your labor and cast you off. And so you'll start to see these things kind of work through. Talitha LaFloria, Chained in Silence. This is one of my favorite books, only because it's dealing specifically. Give me a second, guys. It's dealing specifically with Black women. And again, Black women have often been left out of the conversation when it comes to convict leasing. But convict leasing in no way strictly impacted Black men. Black men were, I would say monumentally, the folks who were targeted, but Black women as well. Once again, Parchment Prison in Mississippi, and Robert Edwards is on here saying now, yeah, Texas, Viter, Vita, Texas. Don't let the sun set on you in Vita. And that's the whole point. If you're there, sometimes it's death, it's torture, it's these other things. Other times it's tied directly to the convict leasing system where your labor is now the reason why you've been pulled in, pulled over, and your labor is what's going to keep you there and probably have you there for the rest of your life. Um, it's a really amazing thing. Like I said, if you ever have the time to study it and you look at Chained in Silence and you work that next to um, Slavery by Another Name, and you'll see how gender in no way made this any better. And in many instances, like I said, men were sexually violated on these prison farms, and the women as well. There's an extra component with the women where, and I won't get into that today, but the forced sterilizations, many of these women had to go in, or the doctors forced them to have to be sterilized because there was that much rape and sexual violation that these women were constantly pregnant. And if it's a women's only prison and the only people, males that are there are the guards, the wardens, the superintendents, the whatever male guards that were there, it didn't make sense that they kept ended up pregnant. They didn't, and these girls were as young in many instances as 11. So this is another instance where again the camps weren't even divided by age. So you would have a 9-year old girl in the same space as a 78-year-old woman. All right. And everyone was subject to the same labor. Everyone was subject to the same punishment. Everyone was subject to the same conditions. And so once again, once you're pulled into these traps, you're stuck there until someone determines they've worked you enough and they're prepared to let you go. That is strictly at the whim of whoever was that's running the prison or who's running that particular industry. And one final book, One Dies, Get Another, Convict Leasing in the American South. Check these out when you have a moment. Check these films out. Once again, the goal is not to have you traumatized by what it is that I tell you, but to help you um, to be more informed about what's going on now. Because if you don't get it, you won't get it. And there are enough of us that I see on this timeline, and that I see in general. We're policymakers now, but you've never investigated the policy from its origin, so you don't understand in many instances that they have hyper racial indications, and they were meant specifically for things that never stop. And just because racism morphs and its tentacles go into different areas does not mean that it no longer exists. We have to be as vigilant and as counteractive as white supremacy is. So again, for everything that's done on this end, there's a countermeasure. And so when I look at this globally, white folks in some instances, they have us on the ropes. All right. We're still acting like we're dazed and don't know exactly what's going on. But this has been happening in this particular instance, at least since 1866. What did your parents and grandparents and great grandparents do to ward this off? All right. I tell you what they did. They worked legally. They worked super legally. They found out who was sitting on different courts. They found out who the different judges were. They determined which judges had to be elected and voted in and voted out. I cannot stress this enough as we enter into this election season. Every election is local. Every election is local. Every election is local, which means many of the things that we're talking about, even I don't want to get into the Breonna Taylor case it specifically, but I do want you to understand that when you have judges and you have prosecutors in some places that are elected into the spaces where they are, you have to vote. You can't say "Eh, they are always out to get us. They are doing X, Y, and Z. You have a duty, you have an obligation. And when you understand civics and you understand how civically you have a responsibility to vote, you also, I know a lot of you don't want to, you don't want to serve on juries. But can you imagine sometimes how some of the decisions that come down, especially when it's a hyper racial space and a decision has to be made, how differently the outcomes of some of these decisions would be if Black folks actually served on the juries that they were selected to be on instead of saying, I don't feel too good, or I won't be able to get the time off, or I lost the notice, or there's a reason why you're getting that notice in the first place. Okay. And whether we're talking about Emmett Till's grandfather standing up saying, "Dar he," or whether we're talking about, in pop culture terms, some of these books where you start to look at the fact that Black people were not allowed to, not only you couldn't serve on a jury, you couldn't even have a white person arrested for a crime. It was against the law. It was against the law for you to say that white person right there just did X, Y, and Z to me. Wasn't going to happen. And you would never get a grand jury because there were no Black people on the grand juries when they were being selected. You would never get a grand jury to indict, even when the crime was clearly committed and done in full view of everyone in the space. It is your duty as an American citizen to not only register to vote, but to vote and to vote in every election and for everything. If there's an election for a dog catcher, I don't need you to say, I don't have a dog. Vote, find out what the issues are and vote. You don't get to not do this. You don't get to not participate and then hold up your hands and say, they are after us. We are not doing what we're supposed to do to ensure that some of these things don't happen. They're going to try. There are many people who are just evil. There are many people who just like confusion. There are many people who want it to go back to 1860, whatever. All right. That can't be our issue. Our issue is we need this to progress and go forward, which means we have to do what we're legally bound to do as citizens of this nation. All right. I still put my hand over my heart. I still sing the Pledge of Allegiance, Star Spangled Banner. I'm all there for it. All right. But it means I pay to play. So I vote. All right. So with that said, if there are no other questions, I have any other comments, we're going to go ahead and close this session out. Sunday, we're going to kind of keep some of this dialogue going. I know a number of you have been asking. Lovecraft Country is kind of doing my head in right now. And so the history notes are turning into I'm not sure what the hell I'm watching notes. And so all right. It's kind of pulling me in another direction. But there are a number of you who have put suggestions in about television shows that you are watching that have historical notes to them that you want explored a little bit more. And so please send those out as I get them in. I don't want to fly by the seat of my pants with some of this, but we maybe I'll do something else that deals specifically with the Black women that have been put into convict leasing, since there's a bit more information about that I think you need to kind of decompress and pull apart. So Saturday, 3 p.m. we do this again right here. It's informal. We talk as little or as much as you want. You'll have a video load up of a couple of clips of things that you may want to check out before the conversation starts. And again, if you have questions that you specifically want me to answer based upon what we've already talked about and what we're about to go into, You can send them to, and Sophia, I'm ready this time. Acumen Magazine 365 at gmail.com. Again, Acumen Magazine 365 at gmail.com. Kim Webster is asking me, can you add the list of resources on your Facebook page? Absolutely. So as soon as we log off here, I'll go ahead and add those in. Both the films and the books, as well as the website that you may want to go to. And again, if you have questions, please shoot them to me. It's been great. And I look forward to seeing you again on Saturday. All right. Peace.